Hello, my name is Olaf, and today I'm going to show you an example of how you can create use case recipes for your API. So what we mean by a recipe or a use case guide is essentially an overview of API operations in order that makes sense from a use case perspective. And all that, of course, is meant to facilitate developers that need to use the API, need to interact with the API, in order to implement particular use cases, and they need to know what API operations to call in which order, providing what requests in order to get successful responses, etc. Now, what you typically see with APIs when they are published is that the details are presented in OpenAPI or Swagger format, so you get an overview of all of the resources in the order in which they have been included in that OpenAPI document, which is great for documentation purposes, but not really useful from a use case perspective. So for that, we can create additional documentation pieces, which I've called a use case guide here, but which essentially reflects what you might call a recipe. So simply explaining the steps that you have to go through in order to successfully complete a use case. Now, the recipe for this API makes sense because it's actually a fairly complicated API. It's a payment initiation API. It is created in the context of UK open banking, where banks allow third parties to interact with their systems to initiate payments. You can imagine that this is not only interesting from a functional perspective, but also from a security perspective, because these APIs are obviously rigorously secured. And that's actually where such a recipe even shows more value, I think, because you do not only provide the developer with an overview of the functional steps in order, but we also allow them to interact with the API, both from a functional perspective, so what parameter values do I need to submit, what payload do I need to submit as part of my request, but also from a security perspective. So let me show you what that could look like. You don't really need to care about all of the details. It's just an example to show how things could look. So this essentially is a static page. It's a static custom page added as an additional piece of documentation to the API. But what we have done is made use of an Akana capability that allows you to include what we call inline test client instances within that static page. So you see that for every operation, there will eventually be, if I scroll down, but you see there's a number of operations here. So all of these blue bars, let me just make this one smaller for a sec. All of these blue bars represent the various operations, and all of these operations need to be executed by a developer building an application in order to successfully execute a use case, in this case, initiate a payment. Now, what is of course really helpful is if you can provide some additional documentation in line with that operation, highlighting all of the essential elements that the developer will need to take care of in order to successfully execute each of these operations in turn. So you see quite a lot of text here, but that's simply because this particular resource requires quite a bit of security steps in order to successfully invoke it. But the Akana out-of-the-box inline test capability already provides a number of things that facilitate this whole implementation. For example, if you see this inline test client, you see that the payload content, for example, is automatically loaded into the client. So the developer does not have to manually create that or copy-paste that. Obviously, all of the other relevant runtime details have already been populated, like the virtual endpoint in this case that we are going to for this particular operation. Now, functionally, this is all we need to do, really. So we need to provide this payload, and that's supposed to give us a request, provided that we also adhere to the security constraints that are associated with this API operation because of the Akana policies that have been associated with that API operation. Of course, we need to associate this request with a client, with an application identity. In this case, because we are talking banking security, we actually need to use a key store, so a key to identify the client. So let me quickly upload a key that should work. This one here, which of course is secured with a password. And now we are able to go through the various security steps. 2 steps essentially, OAuth security. So I need to request a valid OAuth access token, which the tool allows me to do. The access token is actually right here in the debug information. Go to the next step. The next step is securing the payload. So we actually need to apply a digest on the payload. That's an open banking requirement. And again, if you do not really know how to deal with this policy, it may be a little bit complicated, but since we have all this information right here, it's actually a very simple matter of copy-pasting that information in, right? Because it's all described there. It may even be possible to also pre-populate this information into the policy. But for now, let me just manually copy-paste that in. So we need to provide some values here. This value is actually relevant because that's compared to the actual key store that we just uploaded. And the other values are just aligning with what the policy is expecting. So you see, information is all provided here. The developer can actually also read what it's all about to understand what it is that he or she is doing right here. And once I've provided the information, I can hit next, finish. And now everything should be in place to successfully invoke this operation. So let's give it a try. And indeed, we get a post 200 response with a response that's being returned by this operation. Now, it could be that I need some of this information, for example, this ID here, to go to the next operation. So if I now want to review the details of that object that has just been created, it may be that the next step requires me to enter that information as a parameter. Actually, it's already been pre-filled here as an example, but if it were not the case, I could then copy-paste the value that was just returned by that previous operation. So you see that this again helps the developer to go through the various steps and get a clear understanding of what these various API operations really are all about and what is required in order to successfully invoke them in an order that allows the developer to execute the entire use case. So what we've shown here is how to support an API recipe, if you will, partly through static documentation and partly through out-of-the-box functionality that you can simply embed into the static page. So all of these blue sections here are essentially those embedded test clients. So it's very easy to configure this. You can very easily apply this to all of your operations, regardless of, let's say, the number of operations, the policies associated with those operations, etc., etc. So to a very large extent, the implementation can be reused. It's just the specific details that are different from API to API. So which operations to support in your recipe, for example, that you will need to modify for each API. And that's essentially all there is to it. So I think apart from the out-of-the-box capabilities that the Akana portal is offering, this is a very important addition that really helps to support your API consumers, your developers that are working with these APIs.